Chapter 1783. It was that night. Didn't Shan run out? Then. Fang Tong Tong gave a vague explanation. Mom, don't be here. Mrs. Fang was enraged when she heard that. Yi Shan ran out and then the two of you hooked up? Tell me. Mrs. Fang's voice wasn't soft and Fang Tong Tong was nervous when she heard it. She immediately hung up the phone and said, Mom, there's nothing like that. Don't overthink it. Nothing? Mrs. Fang stared at Fang Tong Tong's phone. Why did you hang up the phone if you didn't? You asked this man to tell me. What's the meaning of this? You're two-timing, aren't you? No. Fang Tong Tong was about to explain when her phone rang again. When she saw old Shin's name on the screen, Fang Tong Tong covered her phone and said, Mom, it's none of your business. Go back to your work. No way. However, Fang Tong Tong ran out with her phone in her hand. In a few moments she was out of sight. Mrs. Fang stomped her feet in anger. Since she couldn't catch up to Yi Shan, she turned around and picked up the landline to call Yi Shan. After Fang Tong Tong confirmed that her mother hadn't caught up to her, she heaved a sigh of relief. She answered the phone. Hello. What did you mean by that? It's about that day. After Yi Shan ran out, didn't you go home to bandage up your wound? I went back to Yi Shan's house. You didn't come back and neither did Shan. That night I called someone and accidentally let it slip. I said that the two of you might break up. If you didn't say it first, then Yi Shan would. After all, you're a man and you've been slapped in public. No one can stand it, right? Fang Tong Tong, you're the most disgusting and troublesome person I've ever met. Shinjilia was so angry that he didn't bother to hide his anger. What happens between me and Yi Shan has nothing to do with you. Today I'll make things clear with you. Regardless of whether or not Yi Shan and I end up together, right now, at this very moment, I really love Yi Shan. Even if Yi Shan wanted my life right now, I wouldn't have anything to say. As for you, before this incident, I treated you as Yi Shan's best friend. Now, I only treat you as a wishful-thinking mistress who only knows how to use underhanded means to destroy other people's relationships. Every word was enunciated clearly. Shinjulia's tone was harsh, but every word was deadly. Fang Tong Tong gripped her phone tighter and tighter as she gritted her teeth. However, his eyes had already turned red. She stared at the coarse wall in front of her and took a deep breath. She opened her mouth to speak, but tears were already flowing from her eyes. Shinjulia. You'll regret this. Fang Tong Tong was on the verge of crying out loud. However, she managed to suppress the urge with her rationality. Shinjulia naturally knew how much damage his words would cause to a girl. The guilt in his heart grew. Chapter 1784. When she heard the busy tone from the other end of the phone, Fang Tong Tong suddenly felt as though all the energy in her body had been sucked out. His grip loosened and the phone fell to the ground. The ground was made of hard cement. Just by listening to the sound, one could tell that it was a tragic end. Fang Tong Tong stared at the ground. She squatted down and picked up her phone. She blinked her eyes hard and tears immediately formed in her already dry eyes. With reddened eyes, she slowly lowered her head and walked in. Mrs. Fang was on the phone and it sounded like she was quarreling. What do you mean? Isn't Tong Tong good to you? Now that something like this happened between your boyfriend and her, if it weren't for you, would my daughter have lost her innocence? Now you're trying to shirk responsibility by saying that you don't know? I'm telling you it's impossible. Fang Tong Tong was in a daze when she heard her mother's words. Did she misunderstand something? What innocence? What did she mean by that? Why did it sound like Shinjilia had done something indescribable with her? When Mrs. Fang heard the voice coming from behind her, she immediately turned around and looked at her daughter. She waved at her and said, To think that you treated her as a good friend. What does Yi Shan mean by this? Come here. As Mrs. Fang spoke, she had already turned on the speaker. Fang Tong Tong was silent for a moment before she called out, Shan. Fang Tong Tong. Yi Shan sounded a little tired. Can't you be more shameless? You weren't like this in the past. Yi Shan's tone wasn't harsh, but the contempt in it was unbearable. Fang Tong Tong was about to say something, but Yi Shan had already hung up. Mrs. Fang was furious when she heard that and roared, What's the meaning of this? Tong Tong, what does this woman mean? It wasn't just Mrs. Fang. Fang Tong Tong was also fuming with rage. The faint sense of guilt in his heart had completely vanished. If you are heartless, I will be unjust. Since you guys are going to break up, why don't you break up completely? Yi Shan felt that the events of the past few days had tormented her unbearably. The most disgusting thing was that she even felt disgusted by her own home. That night, if the two of them really had that night, it must have been in her little nest. However, he didn't know which bed it was. How disgusting, Yi Qianqian muttered and closed her eyes tightly. Just then his phone rang. It was Xinjilia. Yi Qianqian only glanced at it before turning the phone to silent mode and putting it aside. Yi Yuyu had just come downstairs when she saw Yi Qianqian's extremely troubled expression. She sat down beside her. Yi Qianqian glanced at Yi Yuyu before her eyes landed on her stomach. Time really flies. Did you blow air into your stomach? How did it get bigger so quickly? Go, it's a real baby inside. Feel it? Yi Yuyu grabbed her hand and gently stroked her belly. The child isn't big now. In a little more than a month it should start moving. So fast. Yes, the child can be born after more than 9 months of pregnancy. At that time, don't let her see Aunt's sad face. When she heard that, the corners of her mouth twitched and she replied, I've just fallen out of love. Can't you forgive me a little? Chapter 1805. When she took the evening bus home, she was exhausted. When she opened the door, she found that the lights in the house were on. Yi Qianqian's heart skipped a beat, and she felt her body tremble. It was daytime when she went out, so it was impossible for someone to forget to turn off the lights. Therefore, the lights must have been turned on at night. Yi Qianqian's hair stood on end. She stood at the door and stared at the house. She didn't dare to move or go in. However, there was no movement inside. Yi Qianqian swallowed a mouthful of saliva and finally decided to brace herself to walk in. She took small steps carefully. Creak. It was the sound of the door opening. Yi Qianqian was so scared that her whole body almost jumped up. She turned her head and saw a man standing behind her. Xinjilia raised his eyebrows slightly when he saw her stiff expression. When Yi Qianqian saw him, she was a little surprised and said, You? Xinjilia seemed to have taken a shower. He was wearing a light blue top and beige shorts. He looked very homely. His hair was half dry, but he looked very clean. The fragrance of shower gel permeated his body. Looking at Yi Qianqian's face, Xinjilia walked over. Yi Qianqian's body was tense and stiff. She looked at him and blinked. Xinjilia stood in front of her for a moment and stared into her eyes. After a moment, his gaze moved away from her eyes and landed on her lips. Yi Qianqian's heart suddenly skipped a beat. What is he going to do? Is he going to kiss me the moment he comes? Yi Qianqian's face became hot, and her bare face began to redden at a speed visible to the naked eye. However, Xinjilia's eyes only lingered on her face for a while. Then he turned around and unintentionally muttered, You didn't even close the door. As he spoke, he had already walked to the door. Yi Qianqian felt a little embarrassed, and her face became even redder. She clenched her fists in anger, stomped her feet and gritted her teeth. She shouted, Why are you here? There was no sound behind her. When Yi Qianqian turned around angrily, she suddenly bumped into a wall of flesh. Xinjilia's body didn't move. Just as Yi Qianqian was about to retreat, Xinjilia suddenly reached out and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly against his chest. Yi Qianqian felt as if her heart had skipped a beat. She almost forgot to breathe. His body tensed up as he stared at Xinjilia's light blue top, not daring to move. Didn't you ask me to come? Are you trying to play dumb now? Xinjilia lowered his head and looked at Yi Qianqian's pink face. His eyes darkened. I didn't. Without waiting for Yi Qianqian to finish her sentence, Xinjilia suddenly closed the distance between them and stared at Yi Qianqian with his amber eyes. Yi Qianqian couldn't say anything else. She looked at Xinjilia and her heart was beating incredibly fast. Lin Miao Miao deliberately sized her up and said, That's impossible. I've never heard of Director Shin having a girlfriend. Also, how could Director Shin like you? Recently, there have been many people pretending to be Director Shin's girlfriend. How did you know him? Yi Qianqian was infuriated. She could no longer keep up the pretense. The image of a virtuous lady that she had been trying to maintain collapsed. With a dark expression she said, How can you speak like that? Is it true that no one has complained about the hospital's information desk?